I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, "Don't cry for me, Argentina," millions of times from the iconic musical Evita, but I'm also sure many of us here aren't particularly familiar with who the real Evita was. Eva Perón was so much more than an idealized character in a musical. She was a Latina woman who started off as an actress and rose to power through the use of her charm and influence. And she redefined Argentina forever through her wielding of populism and using it to advance activism and social justice movements within the country. In American-centric lenses and often through racialized ones, historical Latin figures are often left out of this discussion, much more so when it's a woman who makes history. I'll be discussing the humble beginnings of Evita before she made her way onto the national stage, then follow her rise to power as First Lady and the legacy she left for Argentina for years to come. First, we'll start with her humble beginnings in Los Toldos. So, where did Eva start? Eva Perón didn't start her life off as Eva Perón. She came into the world on May 7th, 1919, in the provincial town of Los Toldos, where she was known at that point as Maria Eva Ibarguren. She was born into a family of 5, with her being the youngest of them all. Her father, however, had a second family on the side within the same province. And according to the contemporary Hispanic biography, her father kept his wife and 3 other children in a nearby town and never formalized his relationship with Ibarguren, who insisted on using the surname Duarte for herself and her children. As a result, Eva's mother, Juana, went into financial ruin and had to find a way out of it through work as a seamstress. Her father died in a car accident in 1926, and considering that she was technically the second family, she wasn't even allowed to go to her own father's funeral because her father, Juan, wasn't technically married to her mother, Juana. He was able to leave the family with ease, leaving Eva's mother to be the sole provider in the night. And in the 1920s, the concept of adultery was extremely shameful. Being a second family was disgraceful to many in society, and most of that blame fell on the woman. These turn of events were key moments that paved the way for Eva to become an actress later on as a young adult. Her mother relocated the family to a small town in Argentina called Junín, where her oldest sister worked at the postal office and her mom ran a boarding school. And despite the instability in Junín, she knew that she wasn't set up for the provincial life and made way out of the capital to Buenos Aires to become an actress. And this dream came from going to the cinema every week and seeing her own idol on the silver screen, Norma Shearer. And to back this up, the contemporary Hispanic biography states that after completing her secondary studies in Junín, 15-year-old Eva Duarte traveled to Buenos Aires to look for work on one of the popular radio serials that dominated the airwaves. The radio serials of her time were essentially TV shows on the radio that people all over the country listened to and followed. This use of her voice was the start of her rise to fame, and she later brandished it to her advantage. And by the late 1930s, Eva was everywhere in Argentina. She was incredibly famous and appeared in magazines. She did 20 plays, 5 films, and she was earning a hefty 5,000 pesos by 1943. And by today's standards with hyperinflation, 5,000 pesos are worth less than 1 cent today. In 1943, the Association of Argentine Radio was founded, and with Eva, they chose her to be its spokesperson. She proved herself from a young age that taking the risk of moving to the capital for fame paid off in the long run. But by 1944, her entire life changed when she met Juan Domingo Perón, the future president of Argentina. On January 22nd, 1944, when he was still known as Colonel Perón, the Secretary of Labor and Welfare, they met at a benefit concert that he had organized for the victims of an earthquake that had struck Argentina. Since that fateful night they met, they were instantly in love, and according to the contemporary Hispanic biography, they began sharing adjoining apartments almost immediately, and Duarte continued her film and radio work. By this point, she had it all. She'd achieved her dream of making it out of poverty, she became an actress, and she found the love of her life at the peak of her game. So when someone tells you that getting your dream job and dream man is near impossible, you can always look to Evita to keep your standards high. So now that you know about how Eva started off and made a name for herself, this brings us to discuss her rise to political power within Argentina. So according to the Encyclopedia of World Biography, in October of 1945, Juan Perón was imprisoned and arrested by a group of military men opposed to his political ascendancy. The Encyclopedia of World Biography stated that she was his ride or die by this point in time, and she used her fame and her communicative skills to Perón's advantage by organizing a massive demonstration in Argentina, which ultimately led to his release from prison. A few days upon his release, on October 21st, 1945, Juan and Eva got married, and by this point in her life, she had begun to use her fame and her voice to speak up for Perón and began to delve into political activism for the people of Argentina, and most importantly, the husband she was enamored by. In 1947, in his campaign for president, Perón promised to deliver on women's suffrage. And Eva, now Eva Perón, played a critical part in this, to which, due largely to her efforts, suffrage for women was enacted in 1947, and in 1951, women voted for the first time in a national election. This big push for women's suffrage in Argentina was largely influenced through the campaign she had led for Los Descamisados, the most marginalized and less privileged within Argentine society. Her mobilization of women and empathy for those left behind in society set the stage for Argentina's development over the next 75 years, ultimately creating the Female Peronist Party, which would come to push for the legalization of gay marriage in 2010, making it the first Latin American country to do so. Eva Perón at this time was a strategical and influential powerhouse, and her skills in communicating and influencing others were leveraged strategically. Eva used her influence to seat and unseat ministers of labor and top officials of the General Confederation of Labor, the chief labor organization in Argentina. Ultimately, for all practical purposes, she became the Secretary of Labor, supporting workers' claims, higher wages, and sponsoring a host of social welfare measures. Eva took over these sectors in the Argentine government due to her charm, her influence on the public, and her communicative skills. However, these tactics she used to gain leverage within the government were done to consolidate power for Perón, who was incredibly inspired by Benito Mussolini's fascist ruling hand. Juan Perón was a big admirer of European fascists and thought that the best way to hold power in Argentina was not only to be a fascist himself, but also to provide for every Argentine citizen to master the grabs of power. Growing up poor, Evita felt it was her duty to speak for the poor as well, and she devoted several hours every day to audiences with the poor and visits to hospitals, orphanages, and factories, according to the Encyclopedia of World Biography. In Junín, Evita lived in a household supported primarily by her mother for herself and 4 other children, and poverty in Latin America has historically been a chronic debilitator of upward mobility, and she used her influence to make a change within this frame. While the help for the poor and marginalized benefited millions, we all know that nothing comes free. Everything comes at a cost, and even the things that help those most in need. In 1947, Maria Duarte de Perón Welfare Foundation was established to serve the poor, and it grew into an enormous semi-official welfare agency which distributed food, clothing, medicine, and money to needy people throughout the country, and even upon occasion to those suffering from disasters in other Latin American countries. The foundation was ultimately funded and financed through contributions, donations from trade unions, businesses, industrial firms, but the financing didn't come through willingness. It came from coercion and force from the Perons. Eva's well-intentioned movements made the lives of millions easier, but with every action comes a consequence, as we all know. And for many in Argentina, the consequence of questioning all this goodwill that came about led to silencing. The mobilization of women and social welfare with the Perons alarmed the Argentine oligarchy, and they held a deep disdain and resentment for both Juan and, most importantly, Eva herself as the kingmaker. The oligarchs in Argentina saw Eva as unacceptable because of her own humble background and earlier activities. While Argentine oligarchs were opposed to her because of her agenda, Eva also took great pride in these movements for women and social justice because she felt that the masses had to be convinced that they were indebted to the Perón regime. As beautiful and charming as Eva Perón was, she was incredibly driven at eliminating the oligarchy and opposition to her and Perón's power. And beneath the bleach blonde facade and the Dior gowns, she was ruthless and vindictive to her political enemies. Now that we know about her rise to power in Argentina as the First Lady, we can begin to discuss the legacy that she left behind for Argentina since her death on July 26, 1952. By June 1951, she was nominated to be his vice president amongst impeding political instability in the country, and she was supported by the GCL in Argentina. But opposition within the military and her own failing health caused her to decline the nomination. At the time that Eva was nominated for the role of vice president, she had been diagnosed with a rapidly deteriorating cancer in her body that was eating away at her health. Support for Perón was shaky, and Eva by this point in time was the only one holding the Perón government together. She was essentially the glue for her husband's presidency. On July 26, 1952, Eva succumbed to the cancer, and upon Eva's death, it produced an almost unprecedented display of public grief, and Perón's political fortunes began to deteriorate. They began to deteriorate because it was Eva who was truly pulling the strings in his presidency and wielding populism in his favor, of which he did not know how to do himself. On top of that, the oligarchy continued to embroil in resentment towards Perón, and support continued to decline. The death of Eva created a chasm within Argentine society and to the ultimate downfall of the Peronist government after 9 years in power. For reference, the Argentine constitution only allows 8 years of being president, so when she died, so did his government. He was ousted in a military coup, and according to U.S. national intelligence, right-wing death squads with links to the Perón government and the security forces, notably the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, the AAA, increasingly targeted labor leaders and left-wing Peronist political leaders, as well as leftist guerrillas. Perón's suppression of the press and the cunning and strategic use of populism and influence by Eva Perón boiled into the final years of his regime, and with Eva out of the spotlight, it exposed Juan Perón's weak underbelly to both right and left-wing opponents. The death of Eva Perón sent the country into chaos and set the grounds for what would later establish a military dictatorship in Argentina later in 1976. She left a huge divide among many Argentines to this day. Many have mythologized her and is seen as someone who contrasted two myths, held respectively by upper-class respondents and working-class Argentines. Eva Perón is a dichotomy for many. Eva's charm and influence, starting off as a radio actress and using that influence to speak up for the marginalized and the poor in Argentina, solidified a legacy for her, but the ulterior motive she had behind this created a darker legacy for many Argentines, understandably, that still continues to be debated. She wasn't perfect like everyone else in the world who obtains power. To say that she was saintly and wonderful just for the sake of it would be a lie. What she did is admirable, but the cost of it continues to be debatable. Many Argentines continue to see her as a saintly and idolized figure within Argentina's cultural tapestry. Her movements in power and government influenced the lives of many and brought equity to many Argentines through her husband's policies. To many, she embodied the Lady of Hope, who would care for the poor, especially the descamisados, the shirtless, recent migrants from the provinces. And it makes complete sense to see her as someone who brought hope for millions in the nation and even felt a sense of debt owed back to her and Perón. The distribution of clothing, food, medicine for the poorest in the country made very real progress towards equity in Argentina. And in Argentina today, especially in the capital Buenos Aires, one can still see statues dedicated to her and Perón, painting them on the street, and she continues to be the face of the feminist Peronist party in Argentina. She abused her gift of influence to intimidate and threaten political opposition and to force proprietors into donations for the poor. And for the Argentines who are against Perón, be it left or right wing, many still see her as someone who represented a black myth. A bad woman who would assault their class interests and the established order. Eva and Juan constantly spoke against the oligarchs of Argentina and private ownership through intimidation and abuse of the press. The president and her seized private companies and put them under state ownership, and they made journalists disappear from time to time. Darling Eva Perón was blessed with both beauty and brains, and if she hadn't died from cancer, it could be very interesting to think about a timeline where Argentina is under Peronism up to this day. So we've discussed the humble beginnings of Evita before she made her way onto the national stage, and we followed her rise to power as the First Lady and the legacy she left for Argentina for years to come. While not a perfect person, the power she had was undeniable. But now the real question is, can a legacy like hers survive in a world where media is so much more accessible than it was 70 years ago? If you want to influence and make a change in the world, Eva teaches us one thing. You have to be good at communicating first.